Mark chapter 9, beginning at verse 33. It says, Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all. Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now John answered him, saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us. But Jesus said, Do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is on our side. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name because you belong to Christ, assuredly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. And so we're going to begin looking at just a little bit about what is taking place in this particular set of verses. In verses 33 and 34, we find out that once they have arrived in a home in Capernaum, that Christ begins to ask his disciples, what is it that you were disputing among yourselves on the road? And so, first of all, I would consider this idea of dispute, or it could have been a discussion, but there was something going on that they were having a discussion and a disagreement on while they were traveling. And rather than respond, it says they chose to keep silent. And the reason for that is they had disputed amongst themselves who would be the greatest. And so if someone asks you a question as to why you are arguing about something, really the only reason that one would do that is because they're embarrassed about what it is that they were arguing about. And it's interesting if you think about it. This is just after Jesus has talked about in the previous 2 verses or 3 verses, 30 through 32, all of the humiliation and the pain that he is going to go through. And so we see here that from that last text, they didn't understand what it was that he was saying to them or what it meant, and they didn't bother to take the time to ask him, or they were too afraid to ask him. So instead, they began to dispute about something else. And one writer says, according to MacArthur, says, spot on, the Lord has just spoken to them about his humiliation, and all they can think about is their exaltation. And so, just like when children sometimes disagree or argue, and then your parent comes to them and says, what is it that you're arguing about? And the children don't want to say, it's generally because they're embarrassed by their particular action. They're embarrassed by their behavior. And this is what's happened to the 12. They're ashamed of what they have been arguing about, in the sense of having to admit that to Jesus Christ. So in verse 35 and 37 through 37, the first phrase that we look at is it says, and he sat down. And traditionally, this was the position for a rabbi or a teacher, that a position that they would take before beginning to teach. It was common for them to, as a teacher, to sit and have others now come and sit and listen to them and hear what they have to say. So the fact that he takes the time to sit down here should signify to the 12 that this is going to be an important lesson that he has to teach them. Now is the time to really listen and hear what I have to say. I'm now taking on the role of a teacher, and I have information that it is that you need to hear. And so he begins his teaching by saying, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. And we know this idea of if anyone, it was clear the disciples wanted to be first. That's what their dispute was about. They were arguing about who was going to be first or who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And what Jesus is teaching now goes against the concept that these 12 men would have understood. And he's saying that true greatness in the kingdom requires humility enough to make oneself a servant and last, because God honors humility and not pride. So here they have this idea of who's going to be the greatest, how can I be exalted, and they're concerned about being prideful and being lifted up. And Jesus is turning everything around and saying that the one that is to be first will be last of all and will be servant of all. And of course, if we really look into and we understand what he's saying here, we realize that Jesus Christ is first in the kingdom. He is last of all in regard to being a servant to all men. That is what ultimately he becomes, where he's headed. He's on his way to be a servant of all mankind and to die for them. And then he gives an illustration. In verse 36 it says, he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. And so we recognize, first of all, that if he's in the midst of them as they're sitting, and we understand they're sitting and he is teaching, that they're not going to miss this illustration. It is very evident. It is something that is going to be very easy for them to understand. And so what he does is he uses this child as a he uses the child as a representation of one who needs to be served. And if you stop and think about that, we understand that. Especially when you're talking about an infant child. It is someone who is in constant need of care. And a child needs to be served and cared for, but they don't have the ability to return that service. They are not able to, in kind, serve them or serve us as we have served them. So there's this illustration of this person who is in great need. And really what we're talking about here is the child is a representation of one who has either not heard and is looking to learn, or is someone who is new to the faith and is one who needs to be cared for. And he goes on to say, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And this idea of receiving this child is to welcome them openly. It is to accept them. And so if you are accepting this individual, you are accepting the responsibility that comes with accepting this person. You are accepting the responsibility to serve this individual, to help this individual. And it's something that you're saying, I accept freely. I do it openly, I do it of my own will, and I will take on that responsibility because I recognize that this person needs this care. And I'm doing it with an understanding that they're not able to necessarily reciprocate that service. And we recognize that Jesus was a servant of all, and when we receive a servant like him, we receive him, and ultimately we're receiving God the Father. When we welcome these people who are young in the faith, when we welcome these people who are in need of being served, who need help in being taken care of and being trained and being taught, we are receiving a servant like Jesus. Jesus was a servant. When we take these people in, we take them to care for them that they may one day serve as well. Then John answered him, saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name. And so we kind of switch gears here just a little bit. And this phrase that John uses, this term casting out, indicates that he was able to remove demons. He was able to do what it is that Christ had given his 12 disciples the ability to do. And he says it was being done in your name. And we've talked about the idea of when something is being done in your name, it speaks of the authority behind being allowed to do what you do. It is through Jesus' power and the power of his name and his ability and the power of God that he has this authority to be able to cast out demons. He recognizes, and he's not claiming that it is something that he is capable of doing in his own name by his own power, but he is actually acknowledging that he is able to do this miracle in the name of Jesus, through the power of Jesus and what he supplies. And so John continues to say, we forbade him because he did not follow us. And when you get in, this term because is leading into an explanation. We did this because. And John is trying to justify why they tried to prevent this man from continuing. He's saying why we told this man not to continue to do what he could do, what he was doing. And so his logic flows kind of like this. This man does not follow us, so by extension he must not be a follower of Jesus. And he seems to be judging the man's heart or the reasoning behind what the man is doing. And so because he's not with us and because he's not following us, we told him to stop. But Jesus said, do not forbid him. And Jesus now lets John and the disciples know that they are not to prevent this man from continuing to cast out these demons or continue to do what he is doing in the name of Jesus. And he goes on to say, for no one, and for is another reason or a because type word, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterward speak evil of me. So he's doing this work in my name, he's glorifying me, and he's not going to be able to then turn around and say something bad about me. If he's able to perform these miracles, and he's able to do so, and he's recognizing that it's through my authority, then it's not likely that he's going to turn around and say anything negative about Jesus. He is actually speaking positive of Jesus and what Jesus does for him. And we understand that the ability to cast out demons is miraculous. And this idea of in my name shows that what the man was doing, he was doing by the authority of Christ and for his honor. He was allowed to do so because it was being done as a way to honor Christ and to continue to show Christ's authority and Christ's power. What he was doing was actually a positive thing for Jesus and his teachings. So he goes on to say, for whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, assuredly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. And there's really not a lot that I can talk about here. This idea of a cup of water is just the smallest of things. You would understand that a cup of water is a very minor thing. But if it's given to you in the name of Christ because you belong to Christ, it's a recognition that this person is doing this because of the fact that you are serving Christ and stuff. He says, I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward because he is doing this for you because you are of me. Again, it's something that allows for you to continue to do your service for me. And that is a service provided to you. One writer, Widersby, put it this way: it is not necessary to perform great miracles to prove our love for Christ. When we lovingly receive a child or compassionately share a cup of cold water, we are giving evidence that we have the humble heart of a servant. After all, we are serving Christ, and that is the highest service in the world. And so really, That's what this whole section is about. And that's what you really want to relay to, well, first understand, and then really relay to someone that you may be teaching. It is the importance of what it means to be a true servant, and the fact that it is necessary for anyone who chooses to be of Christ, to be a part of Christ, to belong to Christ, as the statement above says, because you belong to Christ. In order for anyone to belong to Christ, they must learn to forget about being the greatest, forget about being first, and humble themselves and serve in whatever way possible. I appreciate your time. I would encourage you once again to go back and to look at this particular text to see what you can draw from the scriptures, see how that it speaks to you. It is one of maybe the slightly more difficult for someone to understand if you are trying to teach them this concept. And my encouragement to you is to try to keep it as simple as possible. The general gist of this particular passage could be summed up, our set of passages could be summed up in Jesus correcting the disciples' understanding of how one is to become the greatest. Jesus gives an example of how we must be willing to receive those who are in need, how we must receive those who are new to the understanding, and we must be willing to serve them. Jesus talks about the idea that just because you're not directly with me right now, if you are doing and teaching things in my name, if you are teaching in his name, then you are not showing yourself to be against Christ, but you are actually showing yourself to be for him. And certainly this was an action that was being done in order to honor Christ, and that's why it was allowed. And then lastly, this idea of it doesn't require great miracles to prove our love for Christ. If we are willing to simply be compassionate enough to receive a child or simply share a cup of water, we're showing the humble heart of a servant. Again, appreciate your time, and we will, Lord willing, pick up at verse 42 in another session. Thank you.